بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذ قال له ربه أسلم قال أسلمت لرب العالمين ووصى بها إبراهيم بنيه ويعقوب يا بني إن الله اصطفى لكم الدين فلا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أم كنتم شهداء إذ حضر يعقوب الموت إذ قال لبنيه ما تعبدون من بعدي قالوا نعبد إلهك وإله آبائك إبراهيم وإسماعيل وإسحاق ويعقوب إلها واحدا ونحن له مسلمون تلك أمة قد خلت لها ما كسبت ولكم ما كسبتم ولا تسألون عما كانوا يعملون صدق الله.
Jazakallah. Takbir. So we're going to start the program today. We have a program, inshallah. It's beneficial, inshallah, to everyone. It talks about Islamic will. It gives you perspective about both Islamic perspective and as well as the legal perspective. So we have Mufti Abrar Mirza here, and the program would be is like Mufti Saab is going to talk about the Islamic perspective. He's going to spend initial half of the program, and then the rest half would be Attorney Zubair Tajuddin. He'll be here shortly. So then we could have 15 minutes for question and answers. I request everyone, if you have any questions, we're going to have cards up there. Mufti Saab would like the written questions. Please, I request everyone to have the questions to be written down. If you have any questions to be asked. Further, you can start the program. I would like Faisal to come over here and give the brief, introduce Mufti Abrar.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum.
Alright, I'm just going to keep this short so Mufti Abrar can get started with our program tonight. Mufti Abrar began his Arabic and Islamic studies, a double major program at Benedictine University with IT. He later enrolled at Darul Qasim in Glen Ellen, and then after that he was able to enroll in a summer Arabic program at Mahat Alim al-Islam in Elgin, upon which he's decided to continue his studies in the religious sciences and help form the first batch of graduate students from the Alim program. He thus had the good fortune to study under recognized scholars, including the renowned commentator of the Quran and former Sheikh al-Hadith under Darul Ulum in Deoband, Maulana Muhammad Naeem, may Allah have mercy on him, under whom he completed the study of Sahih al-Bukhari. Mufti Abrar graduated from Benedictine University in 2006 with honors and degree in information systems while simultaneously pursuing his Islamic studies full-time. He completed his Alim course in 2007 and thereafter enrolled at Madrasa in Al-Alamiya, Camperdown, South Africa, to specialize in the field of issuing legal verdicts, which is fatwas. In 2009, Mufti Abrar completed his training under the tutelage of Mufti Ibrahim Desai, may Allah have mercy on him, a world-renowned jurist and expert in Islamic finance. He's also fortunate to have received authorization to narrate from 44 books of hadith. Mufti Abrar is the founder of the American Fiqh Academy and is active in the field of research and issuing legal verdicts, fatwas. In addition, he's the head Mufti at Al Raita, Chicago, where he trains ulama in the field of issuing legal verdicts. I'd like to hand the mic to him. Continue right now.
mic راحي.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام. थोड़ा और करीब
الحمد لله الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وأزواجه وذريته وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اجعلنا منهم آمين. Dear brothers and respected sisters, first of all, I would like to thank Brother Ata and the Masjid for organizing the program and for inviting me and for setting this up. Everyone who worked behind the scenes with the cameras, with the mics, with the marketing, whatever it may have been, everyone who's involved in the effort, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you and accept from you. And everyone who's gathered here in the Masjid, in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the sake of learning about the ahkam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from us as well. As was mentioned in the introduction, this is a two-part program. There's an Islamic perspective, and then there will be a legal implementation of those Islamic ideals that will be covered by Brother Zubair, inshallah, thereafter. What I would like to talk about here is about the preparation for death and the distribution of the estate. And the goal here is to understand the Islamic approach and at the same time to take necessary actions. There's ilm and there's amal that needs to come from it. So inshallah we'll study, and then the goal here is how do we put that into practice. The agenda from my part will be first to talk about the Islamic perspective on what comes even before that, which is the preparation for it. And thereafter start to then get into the differences between what is inheritance and what are bequests, what is mirath, what is wasiyah, some of the words that you may hear. Talk about what should be the reaction of our family members and our friends, of us when we know and hear of someone else passing away. Like, what's the proper Islamic approach in terms of that reaction? And then get into what is the distribution of the estate, how does that look like, clarifying some misconceptions, and then finally with some practical advices. Inshallah, thereafter, Brother Zubair will talk about from a legal perspective, and then we'll do a combined Q&A thereafter. So I would request that inshallah we hold off questions until the Q&A session, and then inshallah to facilitate that, it would be best if those questions were written, inshallah. Now first, in terms of preparation for death, one of the things that we have to recognize is that there's a lot of things in life that are uncertain. We don't know how they're going to play out. We don't know how they're going to shape out. But there's one certainty in life. And that certainty in life is, as Allah SWT mentions, وَمَا جَعَلْنَا لِبَشَرٍ مِّن قَبْلِكَ الْخُلْدَ أَفَإِمِّتَّ فَهُمُ الْخَالِدُونَ, that we have not made eternity. We're not made for any human being that they're going to live for eternity. So if you, O Messenger of Allah ﷺ, if you are going to pass, that do the other people think that they're going to live forever? That Allah mentions, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ وَنَبْلُوكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً وَإِلَيْنَا تُرْجَعُونَ. That every single soul is going to taste death. That every single person is going to pass away. That's one certainty in everyone's life, is our life will come to an end. That's certain. And our approach toward this thing that we know is a certainty in our life is that it's not something that we just wait for it to happen because we know it's going to happen. Rather, our approach is that we have to prepare for it for when it happens. We know the famous incident where a person asked the Prophet ﷺ that when is the hour? when is the day of judgment? And the Prophet's response for that was, what have you prepared for it? That the day of judgment, that person's, the day of judgment and that person's what is called like their smaller day of judgment, which is that person's passing away, and the questioning of the grave that happens thereafter is sometimes referred to as the smaller of the day of judgments. That those are, we don't know when they're going to happen. What's important isn't to know when it's going to happen. The important thing is how are we going to prepare for when it inevitably does happen. And Allah also mentions فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَقُمْ مِنَ السَّاجِدِينَ وَاعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيَكَ الْيَقِينُ. That glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and be amongst those who prostrate in the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and وَاعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ, worship your Lord until certainty comes to you. That وَاعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيَكَ الْيَقِينُ, until certainty comes to you, and certainty here is death. That's a certainty in our life, that until it comes to you. So for ourselves, the way that we prepare is first and foremost, we have to pray that we pass away in a state of iman. That everyone is going to pass away. Our dua and our preparation is to make sure that our passing is on a state of iman. A state where we have lived a life in our struggle, in our attempts to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to stay away from sins. And that when we fall short, that we make tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And shaitan, we know, tries until the very last moments to take a person away from the deen. And it is our dua that, especially at the time we're passing, that we're not tested and that it doesn't become a time of fitna, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps our feet steadfast on iman in our last moments. At the same time, this is for us, but we also have an obligation toward our families. And that obligation is to advise them to stay firm on the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after our passing. The Hafiz, he recited verses from Surah Baqarah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the story of Yaqub alayhi salam. Allah mentions وَوَصَّى بِهَا إِبْرَاهِيمُ بَنِيهِ وَيَعْقُوبَ يَا بَنِي إِنَّ اللَّهَ اصْطَفَى لَكُمُ الدِّينَ فَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ. That Ibrahim alayhi salam advised his children, and Yaqub as well, that, oh my children, when I pass away, that Ya Baniya, O my children, Inna Allah astafa lakum ad-deen, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen the deen for you. فَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ. So make sure that you don't pass away except in a state of iman. This is the advice of Ibrahim alayhi salam, this is the advice of Yaqub alayhi salam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions further on in more detail that أَمْ كُنْتُمْ شُهَدَاءَ إِذْ حَضَرَ يَعْقُوبَ الْمَوْتِ, that were you present when death came to Yaqub alayhi salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling our attention of what happened. We don't know because we weren't there. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is informing us of here's what happened at that time. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that إِذْ قَالَ لِبَنِيهِ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ مِن بَعْدِي. That Yaqub alayhi salam tells his children that, tell me, what are you going to worship after me? This was his concern at the time of his passing. So they said, قَالُوا نَعْبُدُ إِلَهَكَ وَإِلَهَ آبَائِكَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَإِسْمَاعِيلَ وَإِسْحَاقَ إِلَهًا وَاحِدًا وَنَحْنُ لَهُ مُسْلِمُونَ. So they said that we are going to worship your Lord and the Lord of Ibrahim and the Lord of Ismail and the Lord of Ishaq, إِلَهًا وَاحِدًا, that one Lord, and we're going to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And وَنَحْنُ لَهُ مُسْلِمُونَ. And we have submitted, and we're Muslims, we have submitted for him. So this was the concern of Yaqub alayhi salam at the time of his passing, which is advice to his family saying, tell me, what are you going to do after my passing? And the answer that he was looking for, and the answer that was given was, we're going to stay firm on the path. We're going to stay firm on the deen. This is our obligation towards our families. كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ. The Prophet mentioned that every single one of you is like a shepherd. You're going to be asked about your flock. Every single one of us has a responsibility. We're going to be asked about that responsibility. Our responsibility to our families is to advise them and say that after our passing, you need to stay firm on iman. Just like we make dua for ourselves, that we stay firm on iman at the time of our passing. Next, in terms of preparation for death, we need to settle our debts. The debts need to be settled in this dunya so that they don't carry over to the akhirah. If you take an example of the shaheed, the martyr, we know that that person is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So beloved that that person is buried in that same state, in that same clothes, with that same blood on him, like that, not washed, not given a separate coffin. That person is buried in that state. That person is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. and that person's sins are forgiven even before that first drop of blood hits the ground. Yet, in Sahih Muslim, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As narrates from the Prophet ﷺ, they said, يُغْفَرُ لِلشَّهِيدِ كُلُّ ذَنْبٍ إِلَّا الدَّيْنِ. That for the shaheed, for the martyr, every single sin is forgiven. What is not forgiven though, is their debts. They need to take care of it. Everything else, Allah will take care of their debts, they need to settle it. The Prophet ﷺ once, Jabir narrates that كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يصلي على رجل مات وعليه دين. That the Prophet ﷺ would not pray the janazah for a person who passed away in a state that they left behind unsettled debts. The Prophet would not pray that person's janazah. And once a person came in such a state, and the Prophet ﷺ asked about that person whether he has a debt on him. فقال عليه دين قالوا نعم ديناران. That yes, that person has a debt. How much debt? 2 dinars. 2 dinars. That's it. But nonetheless, unsettled debt. So the Prophet ﷺ said, صلوا على صاحبكم. Then you go ahead, that you Sahaba, you go ahead and pray on your companion. Meaning you lead the salah. The Prophet did not lead that salah. The Prophet said you lead, meaning he wasn't going to lead. Now the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they, Allah Ta'ala mentions that they are ruhama'u baynahum, that they have a lot of mercy amongst them, they have proper brotherhood, so they have concern. So Abu Qatada radiallahu anhu, he then stepped up and said, Huma aliya ya Rasulullah. That those 2 dinars, they're on my head now, O Messenger of Allah. That's not his debt anymore. I have taken over that debt. Meaning now this person doesn't have a debt anymore. So then the Prophet, the hadith mentioned that فَصَلَّى عَلَيْهِ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم, that then after that person took away that debt, after Abu Qatada took that debt on his head, now that deceased person didn't have any debt on him, hence then the Prophet ﷺ prayed janazah on that person. But before, when that person had a debt, just 2 dinars, the Prophet said, you go ahead and leave the salah. And then afterward, the hadith mentioned that فَلَمَا فَتَحَ اللَّهُ عَلَى رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم قال أنا أولى بكل مؤمن من نفسه فمن ترك دينا فعلي قضاؤه ومن ترك مالا فلورثته. That the Prophet once, Allah SWT opened up and the booty and like the wealth came to the Muslims. Then at that time the Prophet mentioned that any person, that I am closer to the believers than even their own selves. So if anyone passes away and they have a debt, that I will settle that debt. And if that person leaves behind any wealth, then that's for the waratha, that's for the inheritors. But before that time, this was the habit of the Prophet. They said he would not lead the salah of that person who had a debt on him. It's very important that we make sure that any unsettled debts that we have, that they be settled before our passing. Now, one thing to note also is on this topic of inheritance, we have to first recognize that this is a very important aspect of our deen. That there is no other ibadah that has been mentioned with such detail in the Quran as we see about inheritance. Like even salah, which we pray 5 times a day, is mentioned in the Quran, or the sawm, the fasting that we do every Ramadan, it's mentioned in the Quran. But if you look at the detail that the inheritance laws have been mentioned in the Quran, read Surah Nisa, verses 11 to 13, you find so much detail of who gets how much in what different scenarios and such. That level of detail you don't find with the other ibadat. And the Prophet mentioned that تَعَلَّمُوا الْفَرَائِضَ وَعَلِّمُوهَا النَّاسِ فَإِنَّا نِصْفُ الْعِلْمِ, that learn about the laws of inheritance and teach that to people. This is like half of knowledge. Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu mentions, the Prophet said that ما حق امرئ مسلم له شيء يوصى فيه يبيت ليلتين إلا وصية مكتوبة عنده. That any person who has to leave behind a will, then not even 2 nights should pass on that person except that they get that taken care of. That person cannot be in a state where they have to write down something in terms of what they're leaving behind for their family, and then even 2 nights go ahead that they don't take care of that. This is something so important that it should be taken care of right away. Now, within the Islamic literature and within Islam, you'll find 2 different words. You have mirath and you have wasiyah. Mirath means inheritance. These are the shares that have been specified in the Quran, that these are non-negotiable. These are set in the Quran. Allah mentioned in the Quran how much the husband will get in what scenario, how much the wife will get in what scenario, and so on. These are percentages that have been set. Okay? Or their distribution, their calculation has been defined. A person cannot change that. A person cannot say, I'm going to exclude this person who's otherwise going to inherit or such. So that's set, that's non-negotiable. The other is what is known as wasiyah. Okay? These are bequests. In translation into English, these are bequests. This is where a person has leeway up to 1/3 of their net estate. And we'll talk about how to calculate net estate later. But up to 1/3 of their net estate, a person has the ability to choose what they want to do with that. So, for example, if they want to say, I want to leave it behind for this organization, for this orphanage, for this hospital, for this masjid, for this other person who's not going to inherit from me, then in all those cases a person can do that. The only thing a person cannot do is assign from that 1/3 to someone who's otherwise already going to inherit from that person. So your spouse, your child, your parent, for example, those who are already going to inherit, you cannot assign additional portions for that person. But anybody else who's not going to otherwise inherit from you, you have leeway, you have an option up to 1/3 of your net estate to decide how you want to distribute that. You don't have to. Okay, but if you want it, you have that option. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu mentions that مرضت عام الفتح مرضا أشفيت على الموت, that once I fell sick to such a point that I thought I was going to pass away. فأتاني رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يعودني, so the Prophet came to visit me. فقلت يا رسول الله إن لي مالا كثيرا وليس يرثني إلا ابنتي أفأوصي بمالي كله. That, O Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم, I have a lot of wealth and there's no one to really inherit from me except these 2 daughters that I have. That can I bequest all of my wealth away? Meaning, for example, in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Prophet said, no, you cannot. So then he asked, for thuluthai mali, what about 2/3 of my wealth? So the Prophet said, no. So then the person asked, a nisf, half, a shatr. The Prophet said, no. So then the person asked, a thuluth, what about 1/3? So then at that point the Prophet said, a thuluth wa thuluthu kathir. That yes, up to 1/3, and even 1/3 is a lot. Okay? And a person may think that, if I'm leaving behind money to my inheritors, my children and my spouse, that they're well off, and I'd rather, all my money be given away in the path of Allah, in sadaqah and so on, that a person may not value leaving behind wealth to their family, and they only think that there's value in leaving behind money to charity. So the Prophet clarified that misconception. And he said, انتظر ورثتك أغنياء خير من أن تذرهم عالة يتكففون الناس وإنك لن تنفق نفقة تبتغي بها وجه الله إلا أجزت بها حتى اللقمة ترفعها إلى في إمرتك. That the Prophet said that if you were to leave behind your inheritors in a good state, then that is better than if you were to leave behind them in a difficult state. And even if, the Prophet clarifying now, that even if they're already in a good state, in a good financial state, the Prophet mentioned that even if you were to lift that morsel of food to the mouth of your spouse, of your wife, that even that is rewarding. Meaning, don't think that if you're going to leave behind wealth to your wealthy children, that there's no reward, there's no virtue in that. The Prophet said, no, even if you leave behind any good deed, any good act that you do toward your family, that is a rewarding act. But that's the difference between mirath, which is set proportions, and wasiyah, which is this option that you have to do what you want up to 1/3 of your wealth. And if a person, for example, has missed fast that they're trying to make up, but they pass away before they're able to make them up, then it is from this 1/3 that a person can say, I have X amount of fast that I haven't been able to make up, so if I pass away, then from up to 1/3 of my wealth, then I want to pay the fidya for each of those fasts. Okay? That's up to 1/3. Now the inevitable happens, a person passes away. What's important to understand is that grieving is natural. It happens, right? This is part of a person's nature, that they're going to be saddened at someone's passing. We know that even the story of the Prophet ﷺ, when his son Ibrahim passed away, that there was an eclipse, and some people said, that this is a sign of the sadness and so on, and the Prophet corrected that. He said, no, the sun and the moon do not eclipse for the death of anyone. Right? They clarified their misconceptions. And he said that the eyes tear and the heart is saddened, but we do not say anything except that which pleases our Lord. That in that state, as sad as the Prophet was, that he mentioned in different narration that even like the Mount of Uhud, that it would not be able to bear the amount of sadness that he has in the heart. That as sad as the Prophet was, he said that, yes, the tears are coming down in the hard sand, but we only say that which pleases our Lord. And the Prophet mentioned, indeed, O Ibrahim, we are bereaved by your departure. And then he turned to the mountain and he said, that, O mountain, if you were as sorrowful as I am, you would certainly crumble into pieces. But then he said, but we say what Allah has ordered us to say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That when someone passes away, our reaction is, we only say that which pleases our Lord. We say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That we're careful that we don't say things that go against our iman, that are incorrect. That a person can't say, this person passed away too soon. That he went before his time. That these are things that we don't, this is against our aqidah. Everyone goes when it is their time. For some people their time is in very late ages. For some people their time is in very early ages. No one goes later than their time, no one goes before their time. We have to be sure that whatever we are saying at those times of grief and sadness, that they're only that which pleases our Lord. And thereafter, the janazah should be rushed, should not be delayed for any reason, unnecessarily. Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu mentions that the Prophet mentioned that he advised Ali radiallahu anhu and said, Ya Ali, O Ali, ثلاث لا تؤخرها, 3 things, don't delay them. What are those 3 things? الصلاة إذا آنت والجنازة إذا حضرت والأيم إذا وجدت لها كفوا. That the 3 things that are Ali, don't delay them unnecessarily. 1, the prayer time when it enters. 2nd, the janazah when it arrives, don't delay it unnecessarily. And 3rd is the unmarried person. If you find a right person for them, or you find the right suitor, then there's no reason to delay that. Okay? After college, after medicine, after X, after Y, a lot of youth want to get married, but then unfortunately their parents keep pushing it out until this, until that, until this other thing. That the Prophet advised that no, if you find a suitable person for that person, then don't delay that. And thereafter, once that person has passed away, now there's nothing that we can do for them except we make dua for them and we send thawab for them, we recite and send thawab for them, we make sadaqah, we send thawab for them, digging a well. There's different acts of sadaqah jari that a person can do for that person who's passed away, and at that point that's all we can do for them. Now the next step after the janazah is going to now be the distribution of the estate. First thing, before the estate is distributed to the inheritors and looking at the wasiyah, the bequest, is first we have to see what are the burial expenses. The burial expenses, without extravagance, the normal burial expenses are technically subtracted from the estate of the deceased, meaning their expenses of their burial are from their estate. Okay? And there should not be unnecessary inviting people and feeding them, and all those other expenses are not the proper ones. Just the janazah, the kafan, the grave, the plot in the graveyard, the services for burying the person, that normal expenses are from the estate of the person. Thereafter, any debts that this person left behind need to be settled. And if the debts happen to be more than the estate, then it's an unfortunate scenario, and thereafter the creditors may choose to forgive, or if the family or other people wish to pitch in and settle the debts, that they can. Otherwise, the creditors will have to settle for whatever amount of money is left over, and they get their receivables in proportion to what is owed to them. But that's the scenario that a person should try their utmost to be safeguarded from. Okay? Thereafter, in the 1/3 of that person's wealth that we said that they have the option to do as they wish, from the 1/3 now, if they left behind any wasiyah, you will give that money to whatever the wasiyah was. And if the wasiyah person made for more than 1/3, it doesn't apply, it's only going to be limited to 1/3. And then thereafter, the mirath, the inheritance, will be distributed to the people. Now quickly, I want to just touch on some misconceptions and clarify those. And amongst those misconceptions is from the fact that Allah mentioned that the male will get twice the share of the female, meaning that the sons are going to get twice the share of the daughters. Some people have taken this and they have doubts in their mind that is this fair? Why are the sons getting twice as much as the daughter? And it's important to clarify that the sons versus the daughters have very distinct responsibilities in Islam. That there is no injustice here. A woman's wealth is her wealth. Her mahar, her income, her inheritance, whatever money she has is strictly for her ownership, her choice of what she wants to do with it. She has no obligation to spend it on anyone. Whereas the man has a responsibility to spend on himself, to spend on his dependents, and sometimes it extends even beyond your immediate family, aunts and aunts and such. There's other responsibilities that a person may have on their shoulders in different scenarios. We don't have time to kind of get into that. And so much so that even the wife, when she passes away, her kafan expenses are on the husband. Okay? So the financial responsibilities are very different between the men and women. Okay? That the men has a lot of other responsibilities, has a lot of responsibility, in fact, that the woman doesn't have at all. And if anything, one may argue that it would be unfair to give them the same amount, given that they have very distinct financial responsibilities. Also, Sheikh Ali Juma, who was the former Grand Mufti of Egypt, he pointed out an interesting fact, and he said that there's actually multiple scenarios where women actually inherit more than men. Okay? But there's 4 scenarios where a woman inherits less than a man. But there's 11 scenarios where a woman inherits the same as a man, and there's 14 scenarios where a woman actually inherits more than a man. And there's other scenarios where a woman actually inherits and the man doesn't. But nonetheless, what is important for us to understand is at the end of the day, the Prophet mentioned that إِنَّ اللَّهَ أَعْطَى كُلِّ ذِي حَقٍّ حَقَّهُ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given every person who has some right their due right. So there is no aspect of us thinking whether someone has gotten their fair share or not. Every person has been allotted their fair share. And finally, I want to mention a few practical advices. These are not ahkam, these are not rulings that a person must do. Over the years, and dealing with a lot of cases, and a lot of times very unfortunate cases of family disputes and such, these are some advices. One is, what a lot of people do is they end up distributing a large portion of their estate within their lifetime. Meaning if a person reaches a certain amount of age and they have sufficient wealth, alhamdulillah, then they set aside a portion of their wealth that they keep for themselves, and the rest of it they distribute within their lifetime, so that the majority of their wealth is distributed in their lifetimes, which should reduce the possibility of any conflict thereafter. Right? When there's inheritance of very large estates, then there's unfortunately conflict. But if the estate isn't that large, then there's less likelihood for conflicts. Again, technically at this point it would be gifting, it's not mirath. Mirath only applies after a person passes away, but a person can, looking at the shares of inheritance, distribute within their lifetime if they wish to reduce their chances of conflict thereafter. Second one here is clarify joint family homes. Okay, there's a lot of cases where it's a joint family home, the parents are living in the house, the mother is in the house, and the eldest son, for example, is in the house, and the house is technically in the mother's name, but the son is the one who takes care of all the expenses, the mortgage, the property taxes, and so on. And now when the mother passes away, technically if the house belongs to her, then the inheritance must happen in the house. And then one person says, well, I've been paying all the bills, and I've been taking care of all the expenses, and I put the down payment and so on, and you guys were too little and you never contributed, but now the house technically is the mother, so everyone has a fair share in its inheritance. Okay, that leads to conflict. Okay? Clarify what that is. Okay? If the mother and the others feel that the house actually really belongs to the son, then clarify that in their lifetime. The title should just be on the son's name. There should be nothing that gives rise to dispute thereafter. Also, Brother Zubair will talk about this, but make sure you have all the details in your will. So he'll talk about some of the legal aspects of it, like the aspect of like authorization for medical decisions and things of that nature. He'll talk about that, but also things such as if you have fasts that need to be made up, you have to put that in your will. If Hajj was fard on you but you didn't go, you have to put that in your will. Mention, I want so and so to go on my behalf. Right? Mention the details. Okay? It's good if you say, in case of conflict, then I want my family members to go to these group of ulama and seek their advice and act on whatever ruling they give. Right? Whatever you can give details to try to limit conflict would be good. Custody of children, such like Brother Zubair will talk about those. Medical treatment, I'm going to skip. I'll let Brother Zubair, inshallah, I know he'll touch on that. as well. I'll mention, I've dealt with cases where someone has been on life support months after months after months, coming to a year, and one child is saying that we should, some children are saying we should remove the parent from life support, and others say that you're just trying to get their inheritance and you just want to kill them. Okay, and there's not conflict in the family. These sort of decisions of what you want to happen at the end of your life should be clearly documented as well. Okay? Execute in a timely manner. Okay? That person shouldn't think that so and so has just passed away, so it's not appropriate for us to talk about their inheritance and distribution. That people shouldn't think that we're concerned about the money and the person has their grave is still wet or so on. It's actually best to execute the will as soon as possible, because that is a time when the hearts are still soft. There's much more likelihood of amicable resolution as opposed to later on. So it should be rushed. The inheritance should be distributed as soon as possible. And finally, do not forego your share. This happens sometimes where a person will say, well, this other sibling of mine is in a difficult financial situation and alhamdulillah, I am well off, so I'm going to forego my share and let that person take the extra, my share and so on. Do not forego your share. You have to take your share. Take your share. Thereafter, you can do with it whatever you want, but you must take your share. And if anyone is saying they want to forego their share, do not let them forego their share. What happens a lot of times is, a sister may say, alhamdulillah, my husband is very well off, our family is very well off, and my brothers are in more difficult financial state, so I don't want to take the money, let them take it. Sure, but what happens 10 years later, 15 years later, memories start to fade, people have different recollections of the events, and then now you get a story where now the sister says that I was emotionally blackmailed into giving up my share, I didn't get my fair share of inheritance. Now there's conflict in the family. Take your share. Thereafter, do whatever you want with it, but you must take your share. So these are some advices, inshallah. I'll hand it over to Brother Zubair, inshallah. He'll talk about how do we take some of the Islamic aspects here and now implement it within a non-Muslim legal system, but still get the Islamic outcomes that we desire.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
My name is Zubair. I am an attorney. I practice in the Chicagoland area, and I was invited to give a brief contribution to Mufti Abrar's discussion about what the legal aspects and the legal side of the estate planning is, and what that means to actually create a will and a trust, and what works, how it works, and what's important, what is it that you should be looking at from a legal Illinois law point of view. So what are we talking about? Estate planning is, in summary, it's the legal process of setting up your financial assets. It's the legal and financial process of setting up and arranging your assets during your life and after your death. State law has certain defects. The state says, Illinois, state of Illinois, or whatever state you're in, says there's certain how your assets will be distributed. There are rules for that. The rules oftentimes conflict with what the Sharia says, not only in how the assets are distributed after you pass away, but also how a lot of people own their assets during their life. They don't necessarily comport with what the Sharia rules are. So we have to be aware of what those Sharia rules are, how we can arrange our assets to make sure that we are complying with Sharia in as much as that is your desire to do so, and how to get that transition done so that you're not going to get hurt. By hurt, I mean you're not going to lose out on complying with the Sharia, but you're also not going to get penalized by the state of Illinois in terms of taxes, in terms of the way you hold assets, in terms of other things that make things more difficult, because if you say, okay, well, I'm only going to do it this way, well, things may become more difficult. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, now we can.
Yeah, sorry. So when we talk about this, there's 6 primary issues that I like to address and that I like people to have in mind when they come saying that, okay, well, I want to do some estate planning, I want to do my wills, or whatever it is that they want to do. There's 6 issues. I will take them in turn. Not everyone has every single one of these issues as a priority, but these are the 6 issues that people need to prioritize and say, okay, what is it that I actually have? What is it that I need to think about? Before we get into that, I want to sort of touch base on what the state defaults are when it comes to some of these issues. First is, when we talk about estate planning, the distribution of assets. The state of Illinois has defaults. If you pass away, if you have a spouse and you have a child and you have children, the default distribution is your spouse gets half and your children share in the other half equally. That's it. If you have no children, your spouse gets everything. If you have only children, the children get everything. If you have neither spouse or children, then it goes to parents and siblings who share equally. Obviously, this is not consistent with what the Sharia says, but that is what is the default in the state of Illinois. And most states, every state is a little bit different, but that's the default. Guardianship of minors. If you have a minor child, and by that minor I mean anyone under the age of 18, if you pass away, your surviving spouse automatically becomes the guardian of the child because they are the spouse. If both you and your spouse pass away, it goes to the courts to decide who gets the kids, who gets to take care of the kids. Now, best case scenario is that somebody else in the family, you have a cha-cha, you have a mamu, somebody else steps up and says, this is my family member, I want to take them in, here is, I want to take them in, and this is my, this is my home, this is my income, I can actually provide for these kids, and the court will say, okay, great, and then they'll assign guardianship. But they're going to assign that based on what the court believes is in the best interest of the child, and what the court believes is in the best interest of the child may not necessarily be what you believe is in the best interest of the child. For example, I may believe that having my kids raised by my brother who's Muslim is better than raised by my neighbor who's not a Muslim. But the court may say, okay, well, my brother has 3 kids of his own, and now they're going to take on 3 more kids, and he lives in a 2-bedroom house, and that's not enough space. And my brother doesn't have the income to support 6 kids. So it may be better if we take these kids and give them into a foster home where they're going to have a little bit more space and somebody else can take care of them rather than a family member. Is that a possibility? Yes, that is definitely a possibility. So what Mufti Abrar was mentioning earlier is that you need to specify from the beginning what it is that you want, who's going to be taking care of them, and what the terms are. So if you say, no, I want only Muslims to be taken care of, I don't care where they are. I would rather my family, my kids be with my relatives in Pakistan or in India or in Syria with Muslims rather than be in my neighborhood with another family. Okay? There are also taxes and fees that are associated with dying. They can be expensive and they can be time consuming to get through that. You just have to make sure that you address that. They're not going to apply to everybody. They may not apply to you, but that's something that we do need to think about and address and say that if that is your priority, if you're very wealthy, you may have taxes. If you have a lot of assets, different types of assets, and you have, say, a lot of property, it's going to cost something to transfer those properties, and that's something that we do need to address and take care of now rather than leaving it for later, especially with the situation that arose before when you have people who have businesses and businesses with partners, and you say co-own properties together or co-own business together, and now one of the partners passes away and you don't know who contributed what because everything was kept hush-hush and everything was between the partners, and now the family members don't know whose share is what, and now it's even a more difficult situation because it's not just a fight within the family, but it's a fight between 2 different families who don't really know each other, who don't necessarily trust each other, and I have a vested interest in figuring out what they want to do. Another issue is that there are probate court consequences. What does that mean? If I pass away and I have a house, and the house is in my name, or if it's even joint with me and my wife, and we both pass away, or if I have a bank account that's in my name and I die, can my wife go to the bank and say, oh, this is my husband, he passed away, can I have the money? The bank is going to say, no, we don't know who you are. You could be just some lady off the street who got a death certificate. We're not going to give you anything. You need to go to court and get me a court order that says I can give you this money. Because I don't want to take, the bank's not going to take responsibility of distributing or giving anybody some money when they don't know who that person is. That process of going to court and getting court orders is called probate. There's also probate taxes, and there's probate fees, there's a cost to it, and there's also a time period. I don't know, is this Cook County or is this Kane County? Kane County, okay. The average time to go through probate court in Kane County is about 1 year. Okay, that's the average time in most of Illinois, except for Cook County is a little bit longer because it's Cook County. But most of Illinois, it's going to be about 1 year. The majority of that, well, not majority, half of that, is that the state of Illinois and most states require that anytime anybody passes away, you have to do a public notice saying, this person has passed away. If there is anybody who they owed money to, you have 6 months to come forward and claim it. So in terms of paying debts, any creditor has 6 months to come up forward to file a claim. And if they don't file a claim within that time, that debt is, the courts, basically the state of Illinois forgives that debt because the creditor didn't come forward in 6 months. But if they come forward in 6 months, then that credit, that debt is there. So you have 6 months just to get through that period. Then once you get through that period, then you can start distributing the assets. And that usually takes another several months. What I mentioned earlier regarding the 6 points, or the 6 issues that people need to consider. First is the issue of distribution. Who's going to get it? Or we talked about mentioned about the wasiya and about the mira. Now, what most people think about when they think about distribution is what I've mentioned here is only the first 2 topics. Who gets it and how much do they get? What are the percentages? And that's actually pretty straightforward because that's spelled out in the Quran, that's spelled out in state law, that may be even in people's mind that this is how much I want every person to get. I pass away, I want $5,000 to go to masjid, I want $5,000 to go to Iman, I want $5,000 to go to this orphanage. They have that. What people don't necessarily think about, what was also important in making sure that the distribution passes according to Sharia is not just who and how much, but how will they receive it? Because there's different methods of receiving it. If you, for example, have a POD on your bank account, what that means is that you have a bank account's in my name, but then I have a paperwork filled out with the bank saying that if I pass away, all of this bank account goes to my son. Now, he has received this money at my death, but he's received it in a way outside of the court supervision. So how is that counted as part of my will? Because if in my will I says my son gets, say, 1/8, or I'm just picking up a number, say he gets 1/8. Now, is this counted or is it not counted? How is it counted? How is it counted against other things he may receive? That's what I mean by how. There's also a question of when they receive it. If you have a 401k or an IRA, and the assets mature when you turn 65, and you pass away earlier, how is that then your heirs aren't going to be able to collect on that until a certain time in the future? How do we calculate that? How do we take that into consideration as part of the distribution? Are they getting it now? Are you going to, or they're going to have to pay taxes and penalties? Are they going to get it at some point in the future? And if they get it in the future and the money grows because it's in a retirement account, how do we count that? So that's another important issue that you have to take into consideration. And then there's also the issue of what they receive. A lot of times, especially the sisters, say that, okay, well, I have all my zevah, and I want this to go to my daughters. I don't care about my sons. They're not going to get any of this golden jewelry. I don't want my daughter-in-laws to get this. This all goes to my daughters only. You have men, or you have fathers who say, okay, well, I want this property. I have 4 or 5 rental properties. I want these to go to my son because he's the one who's taking care of stuff. He's the one who's taking care of it. He's the one who's managing it. And going back to the issues of what they like, how do you determine what the person's contribution is during their life? if the son is helping manage the business and father passes away, parents pass away, now the son is saying, well, I've been working in the business for the last 20 years, you have just, been married and doing nothing, but now you want a half of the business that I built. And that's the source of controversy, but that's also an issue of like, well, how do you determine what each person is getting? When you're determining the distribution percentages are out of the whole, not out of every specific piece of property. So if you have an asset, your estate, all of your assets consists of maybe a house, maybe some bank accounts, maybe some 401ks, maybe a business, maybe rental properties. The distribution is out of the whole. The person is not getting 1/4 of the house and 1/4 of the bank account and 1/4 of the aid. You can say, okay, you get the house, you get the bank account, you get the 401k, you get this, we'll share on this. It's an issue of determination. As mentioned earlier, you do it better. If I spell it out and say, this is what everyone's getting, that might curtail conflict in the future. At the same time, if I do it now, and then they decide, oh, well, you know what, the numbers when I pass away, the values changed, and they still need to fix it. They might have to do that later on. If I do the determination and the distribution now, but that distribution has changed when I pass away. Or that those values change when I pass away. The second issue I already sort of touched upon was guardianship. This is guardianship for minor children. This is also guardianship for adults disabled children. There is a lot of people, like our community has gotten really big, and I actually deal with this a lot, where you have people who have children who are adult and disabled. There's autism, there is various types of genetic disorders, there's Down syndromes, and if you have a child or a sibling in that condition, that's something that you need to address, because a will is the only way to address that. If I'm a parent and I have a child and I pass away, and my child is an adult but he has some autism or Down syndrome or something like that, he goes to the state. The state is going to be determining what happens to him. I don't have any discretion anymore because I'm dead. Even though during my life I'm going to be able to take care of him. That doesn't extend automatically to siblings. It doesn't extend to grandparents. It doesn't extend to other family members. You have to write that down. That applies for adult disabled. That applies towards minor children. You can assign whoever, and you can spell out what the terms are, that they should go to a Muslim school. They should go to, all the siblings should stay together. All the children should have the right to visit grandparents, because that happens a lot where, mother takes over the kids and she's like, okay, well, husband passes away, mother has the children, and she says, well, no, you can't go visit with Dada and Dadi anymore because of whatever family conflicts exist. That happens. And you can spell out and specify that, no, these are the terms and conditions that I want my child to be raised in. One question I often get is, can we have overseas guardians? I want my kids to go back home to be with my family in Pakistan or in India. Can you do that? Yes. I always recommend, though, you have standby guardians, you have U.S. residence guardians named also. Because what if there's a problem? What if there's a time delay? What if it takes time for process paperwork or for the overseas people to get here, the kids to get there? You don't want to just leave the kids dangling for no reason. If for no other reason, then if there is, for example, I'm going home, or you're going home and you get in a car accident, who's going to take care of the kids tonight? Somebody in Pakistan is not going to do that. You have to have somebody here tonight, tomorrow, this week, to make sure that the kids are adopted. The only way in the state of Illinois to appoint a guardian for a child is in a will, or appoint a guardian for an adult disabled child is in a will. Other states may have different rules. You can have other documents or other instruments that allow you to do that, but in the state of Illinois, you have to have a will to do this. There's no way around that. Third issue that I recommend that people keep in mind is of probate taxes. There is a tax on your assets to pass it to your family, to your heirs, specifically your children. Not to your spouse, but to your children. There's a difference on that tax amount if you are a U.S. citizen versus a non-U.S. citizen. So you have to bear that in mind also. So if you're not a U.S. citizen, you're going to pay a higher tax. There is the tax right now for U.S. citizens starts at $11.5 million. So if you have assets of more than that, that's when you pay the tax. If you have less, you're not paying that tax. That number is going to change in a couple of years, and they're always adjusting that number every few years, so you always want to keep that in mind. There's also the state of Illinois charges you a tax to die and transfer your assets to your heir. Right now, that is $4 million. So again, if you have assets, you want to keep that in mind. Most people are under this limit, but not everyone. So we want to keep that in mind. There are ways to avoid taxes. And there's ways to avoid probate courts. There's ways to get around all this stuff. And I'm just talking about Illinois law. I know I'm not focusing on the Sharia. The Sharia is sort of overlaid with this. We're trying to do this, but I'm telling you, look, this is the issues that you need to deal with because you're living here. That's the second level. Okay. So that's the second level that we're dealing with, but we also need to deal with the fact that we're living in the U.S. and you're going to be, or in Illinois, and you're going to be subject to the federal taxes, you're going to be subject to state taxes, you're going to be subject to probate courts, you're going to be subject to all these things. Just saying that, oh, well, I want to do it by Sharia, and just telling that to my son is not enough. That's just not enough here. Why is that not enough? Because, like I mentioned earlier, you can't, the court doesn't believe anybody if they come to court and say something. When you talk, say, if I go to court and say, my brother passed away and this is what he told me, the court's going to say, great, but how do we know you're telling the truth? There's no witnesses. It was an oral statement. What if you were just making it up? We don't know you from the next person on the street. You could just be making everything up. It is required to have a written will in the state of Illinois. There are certain procedures and rules on how to write a will. It needs to have certain language. If it doesn't have that language, it's not valid. It needs to be signed in certain places. It needs to be dated. It needs to have witnesses. It needs to be notarized. If it doesn't have these things, it's not valid. I can't tell you how many times I've had people come. I have had people come and say, oh, I have a will. And I say, okay, well, let me see it. And then they give me some document that they printed out from the internet, and they signed the first page, or the initial 1 or 2 pages, and said, this is my will. And the answer is like, no, this is not a will. This is nothing. This is absolutely nothing. If I tried to take this to court, the judge would laugh at me. And he would throw this in my face. Like, this is not a will. This is not valid. I can't tell you. I have gone to court where people print out something and then they just sign it themselves. They have their friend sign. They have it notarized. That's not a will. It didn't have the proper language. It wasn't notarized in the right place. It wasn't witnessed in the right place. And the judge will throw it out. And I've had wills thrown out because people didn't write, because they just downloaded something from the internet. The people who have done stuff on the internet have done a service. They've done a really good thing. If you have the ISNA wills and various masjids and organizations have the wills, but those things are done for the same person who lives in Florida and who lives in Alaska. The same person who has $50 and $50 million. But the states have their own rules. You have to abide by the rules of the state. What may be a valid will in Florida may not be a valid will here in Illinois. I don't know what a valid will in Florida entails because I'm not a Florida lawyer. I'm an Illinois lawyer, and I can tell you, if you bring me a will that you just printed from the internet and you didn't fill out anything on it and you just signed your name on the first page, that's nothing. That's absolutely nothing. Going to probate court. Why is it necessary? I think we touched on that. The court's not no bank, no title company, no insurance company. Nobody's going to take your word that you are the spouse or the relative of somebody who's passed away. They're going to want proof of that. There are ways to avoid court. There's ways to get around it. The primary way we do that is with a trust. That's what a lot of people end up doing, is a trust. What is a trust? I just want to touch on this briefly. A trust is a legal relationship between 3 people or entities over a piece of property. So, for example, this is Mufti Abrar's computer. He is the owner of this computer. As an owner, you have different rights and responsibilities and relationship with a piece of asset. You have the right to own it, you have the right to gift it, you have the right to use it, you have the right to sell it, you have the right to throw it away if you want. You have all these rights. What we do with a trust is divide up those rights and give it to different people. So you say that I am the owner of this property. I am now giving the right to use this property to somebody else. And I'm the right to benefit from the use of this property to a third party. That is a trust. I, as a grantor, giving a trustee the power to benefit a beneficiary. That is a trust. So when you pass away, you don't own that property. The trust owns the property. The trust is a separate legal entity. It owns the property. And I have written down in my trust saying that if I pass away, I want my brother to be the trustee, and I want the beneficiaries to be my wife and my kids and my parents according to the Sharia distribution. And that's how we get around having to go to court. Because if I pass away, then my bank account wasn't owned by me, it was owned by the trust. And the trust has a successor trustee that my brother can now go to the bank and say, hey, I'm a successor trustee, you have the trust. And you can do the distribution according to Sharia. I can take the money, or he can take the money, and you can distribute it according to Sharia. That's what a trust is. That's how we get around court. Not Sharia, but how we get around going to court here. Fifth issue that we want to touch on is of disability. And this is what Mufti Abrar mentioned earlier. Who's going to make decisions on your behalf? If you become sick, if you become disabled, if you are in the hospital or in a coma or whatever it is, who is going to make the decisions? Do you want your wife? Do you want your son? Do you want your daughter? Do you want your brother? Do you want your cousin? Do you want your physician? Who is going to make those decisions? And what are those decisions going to be? What is it that you want to happen? If you're in a vegetative state, do you want them to pull the plug? Do you want them to keep you alive? Do you have any conditions that you know about? So I know people who have certain types of chronic diseases. So they say, okay, well, if I am getting sick because of if I get in a car accident, keep me alive, do what you need to do to keep me alive. But if I have my heart fails, or if my lungs collapse or something like that, because I have a chronic disease, or I have like cystic fibrosis or cancer or some type of disease, then in those situations, if the disease is taking over, I don't want. And that's a discussion that obviously you want to have with your doctor, with your sheikh, and with your family, saying that this is the time, like what is the decisions that you want to happen, and who is going to be making the decisions. You can't just leave it to say, oh, my family will. Well, because as Mufti mentioned, family's going to disagree. The family may disagree, and I've seen this, where the spouse especially is, you know what, no, I'm not going to let them go. But the kids are like, you know what, stop suffering. There's always a difference between sons and daughters, where the sons tend to be a little bit more practical, and the daughters are a little bit more emotional, and say it's like, no, you can't kill dad, where the son is like, no, dad's not there. That's, he's been in a coma for 6 months. There's nothing to kill. That's a discussion that you need to have, but you need to have it and say who's going to make the decisions. And this also is who's going to make financial decisions. If you become sick or disabled, you're in a hospital, who's going to go to the bank? Who's going to pay the bills? Who's going to sell a property if need be? Who's going to do these things? Oftentimes people do have their family members or close friends, but it obviously has to be somebody that you trust in all of these things. Who's going to do the will? Who's going to be the guardian? Who's going to be power of attorney? You want to assign people that you trust, obviously, because you don't want to leave it to the court to decide on that. But also it should be somebody that they know that that's what their responsibility is. There have been situations that people don't know and people don't discuss because of whatever reason. I always like to tell a funny story that when I was in law school, one of my professors came to class, he was 20 minutes late. And it's like, oh, why are you late? It's like, well, my neighbor died. And he had a 14-year-old daughter, and he left his daughter to me in his will as a guardian. And I never knew this. This is the guy that I lived next door to when I mowed the lawn, but I didn't have a relationship with him. And now I have another teenage daughter. I don't know what to do, so that's why I'm late. And that happens, and I've seen that happen, not necessarily in that extreme of a situation, but people pass away, and their brother comes and says like, oh, I didn't even know. My cousin named me as the person in charge of the will, and I don't know what to do. And I don't even know what his assets were because he was my cousin. And I don't know where his bank accounts are. I don't know where his his properties are. I don't know any of this. What do I do? So it's important to have that discussion with your family on that who's going to be in charge, if you're going to name your brother, your cousin, your sister, especially for guardianship. because, the reality is, like, I have 3 kids, and my brother has 3 kids. And during our life, of course, I'm going to say, yes, if you pass away, I'm going to take in 3 kids. But if he passes away, now all of a sudden I have 6 kids. And that's a reality that you have to face. And that's a reality my wife is going to have to face. If all of a sudden she now has to take care of, raise 3 more kids than she was planning on. So that's something that you need to have a discussion on with the family. Final issue is that I like to also touch upon is that of liability. Liability means that if you own assets, can somebody sue you and take away your assets? Now, this is obviously during your life. After you pass away, you may have debts also, but you may have professional liabilities if you are a doctor, if you are a lawyer, if you have some type of, if you have certain types of businesses that could be subject to a lawsuit, especially if you have like rental properties or gas stations, things like that, you're going to be subject to lawsuits. What can we do, or can there be something that can be done to protect you and shield your assets? Again, this has nothing to do with distribution or Sharia, but this is something that I recommend you do keep them in mind, that when you're arranging your assets, when you're arranging your will and your trust and doing the distributions, you want to keep in mind, okay, well, I have all these things that I want to give to my family, but if all that is going to disappear because of a bad lawsuit, then then we want to address now, is there a way to protect you? What can be done and how can we do that? I don't know what time. Okay. And we're going to, I'll do a few more minutes and then we'll take questions.
You can go 20 minutes. We have 8:30 Isha, so we can.
Okay. All right, so I'll wrap up now and then we can do about 10 15 minutes of questions. That's okay?
Too many questions. It's like
Ji?
there are too many questions.
For the questions, a lot of times what happens is many people are asking the same question. So it tends to be duplicated, so either if you or I, we can answer like 4 or 5 questions at once. But just going over as a summary of the issues that I recommend that you keep in mind when thinking about doing your estate planning and doing the planning, that you're talking about wanting to do it by Sharia, but we also want to address the issues that come up by the fact that we're living here in the United States in Illinois. Specifically, you want to think about the distribution of your estate, not just who gets it and how much they get it, but when they get it, how they get it, and when they get it and how they get it, and what they get. If you have minor children or adult disabled children, you do need to consider who you want to be their guardians, and who you want their guardians to be, and how you want the guardians to be. One important issue I missed earlier, but I do want to mention: if you have co-guardians, what does that mean? I'm just throwing this out there. If I say, for example, name my brother and his wife as co-guardians of my children in my will, I say if I die, I want my brother and his wife to be co-guardians. That means they are together the guardians. That means if my brother dies, my kids stay with my sister-in-law. They don't go to my other brother. Right? So if she gets remarried, my kids go with that other family. They don't go by a family. Keep that in mind when you're making decisions. A lot of times in our community, there's an issue of respect and saying that, okay, well, if I pass away, obviously my parents should be the guardians of my kids. My dad is in his 80s. My mom is in her late 70s. They cannot raise 3 kids. They can barely take it if my kids are over for an hour, and then they get tired. So the respect is important, but also be practical. My recommendation is to be practical and say, okay, yes, you may want your parents or elder family members to say that yes, they should be guardians, but practically speaking, is that something that can reasonably happen? That my 75-year-old mother and my 80-year-old father are going to take care of 3 preteen, 3 kids, ages 10 and under. That's just realistically not going to happen. We also have to another important issue to bear in mind is your tax liability, and if you do have taxes, and probate court, and do you need to go to probate court, and how, is that something that you want to avoid? You also want to keep in mind disability and what decisions you want to make if you are disabled and who is going to be making those decisions. And then finally, if you have a high-risk investments or you have a high-risk profession, we want to make sure that when you pass away and you're giving something, that there is actually something left to give, and it's not going to be lost in lawsuits or things like that. So now we can wait for some questions. Probably most of the questions are for you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Sisters, if they have any questions.
Geez, we want to make sure we get questions, sisters, a little
Yeah,
bit.
we already.
Okay. So sisters, if you have any questions, please make sure that you send the questions as well. I'll read a few questions and answers, and then I'll hand over to Zubair. One is, can properties be equally divided among sons and daughters? So this is, between the children, this is part of the mirath. So remember we said there's mirath and there's wasiyah. Wasiyah is in your discretion, mirath is set percentages. And in that sense, Allah has mentioned that the son, the male will have twice the share of the female, the sons get twice the share of the female, of the daughters. Those percentages, that proportion is set and it cannot be altered. Along those lines, if parents place money in a trust and predetermine how much is to be given in different percentages that is allowed by the Sharia before they pass away and children are not involved in the process, basically they have no say in the matter, then is there any liability on the adult children? Since we have no say, we do nothing, and we are fine as long as we make sure to follow the Sharia requirements for own wealth distribution after we pass away. No, so again, for mirath, for inheritance, the parents never had a choice in what percentage they want to give to their children to begin with. So if they did that, legally that may hold, but Islamically it doesn't hold. It's not correct, and the parents would be sinful. And the last thing you want is, something sinful to occur on your deceased parents as they pass away. So in that case, it is the responsibility of the children to ensure that they fix this issue, they fix the problem, and they readjust the proportions, the distribution amongst them so that each one gets the right amount. Anything that a person has beyond what is their share is you have possession of what really belongs to someone else, what is somebody else's right. It's an usurpation of right that you're doing then. So the children, for their own self as well, this isn't just something wrong the parents did. If they don't fix it, it'd be something wrong that they are doing as well, Islamically. So they have to readjust, regardless of what the parents said, they have to readjust to ensure that the shares that the children receive are in line with the Sharia guidelines. There's a question on what are the rules with primary residence. I believe according to state, spouse is a 50% owner. So this is one that I'll start off with and I'll transition over to Zubair. One important thing to note is within Islamic financial laws, where we follow basic math. So my share and your share together must add up to 100%. Okay? Whereas what the state allows is that two people can be 100% owner of the same thing. So the husband owns 100% of it, and the wife owns 100% of it. So that doesn't work Islamically. Islamically, wife's share plus husband's share must equal 100%. They both cannot be 100% owner. So as you have residence, as you have bank accounts, and those where can talk about this, you have to ensure that you know what percentage belongs to the husband and what percentage belongs to the wife. Otherwise, the state may just look at that as 100% ownership for both, but Islamically that cannot happen.
Right. So that type of ownership in the United States and in Illinois specifically, for bank accounts, if both of your names are on the bank account, what that means is called joint ownership. What that means is both of you own 100% of the bank account. What that means is if one party passes away, their share goes to 0 and the other is still 100. So in my life, I have a bank account, if it's joint with my wife, is she allowed to go and take all the money of the account while I'm still alive? Yes. If I die, can she still do that? Yes. Same thing. Same thing with houses. Most people, if you bought a house in Illinois after about 1985, it's in something called tenancy by the entirety. This is a special type of ownership, of joint ownership. This means that it is owned jointly by a husband and wife with a right of survivorship, meaning both parties own 100% of the property. If one party passes away, the other party still owns 100% of that property. What we want to do with a will or a trust or whatever documents is to make sure that you address that scenario. That if I pass away, my wife is getting 100% of the house, whereas she may only be entitled to, by Sharia, a percentage, say 1/8 of the house. So how do we correct for that? Because she's getting 7/8 more than she should have out of the house. How do we correct for that? Do we correct for that by redoing distribution somewhere else? Do we correct for that by asking her to sell the house? Or do we correct for that by putting that in the trust and saying, no, she just has a right to live in the house during her life and pay that? Or do we say, okay, well, no, she has a right to 50% of the house, but she owes the kids out of the other 50%, that was my share. How do we do that? And that's part of the estate planning process in writing a will and writing a trust and determining, hey, you know what, this is the bank account, this is the 401k, this is the IRA, this is the stock account, this is the house, and how do we account for that distribution in each asset?